Did you know that about 6% of the labor force is veterans? Did you also know that first responders, it's three, four, even five times that? Join me today and I'll talk to Dr. Currie Myers, former sheriff and a criminologist who knows a lot about the police force and how cannabis being legalized could actually help police officers and our first responders.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on Cannabis Reality. Today, we have Dr. Currie Myers with us to help discuss a few things about police work and cannabis industry. One of the things we wanted to discuss is what are the pros and cons for first responders if cannabis was legalized and allowed for the states to regulate. Representative Nancy Mace has a bill right now going through Congress that would hope to give a lot of the regulations back to the states. So we pretty much would eliminate the need for the federal government to really get involved with it. It would be more of a state's regulatory compliance. So, Dr. Myers, how does this respond to first responders? How does this work with first responders if it was completely legalized? What things would we see change, not only just from the administration aspect of it, but also from the PTSD and the recovery from a lot of their work?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm honored, and I'm a supporter of Representative Mace's bill. Actually, it's a good one. It turns it, to your point, it turns it back over to the states and lets the states determine their cannabis policy going forward. And I think that is what really matters. We have to understand also that if the federal government gets too involved, then it's going to become even more regulated and even more taxed than what it should be, which potentially could drive the underground market. But I say this because a lot of law enforcement officers and attorney generals, a lot of chiefs and sheriffs, directors that are superintendents that are head of state polices say that one of their biggest concerns is that still it's federally illegal, and even though the states pass it, do they have a responsibility to potentially enforce federal law or assist federal law enforcement when they come in to work these kinds of cases? And I think that's the big conundrum that's going on with many law enforcement agencies and senior executives. And then you get into grant funding. And there is grant funding, and the federal government loves to tie certain behaviors and responsibilities to local and state police in order to sometimes get those federal funds. So the federal government, in my opinion, has not been a friend to us in this industry, which is really a shame because we've now had, 37 states now that has passed some sort of marijuana legalization to some extent. All of them are a little bit different. And I'm supportive of that. I'm a big believer in the principles of federalism and the fact that states should determine their own cannabis policy. So I think that is really a bigger issue than a lot of people are giving credit to. They think it's, well, law enforcement just doesn't want to act on their own. I think there's many senior executives that says, well, once it's federally legal, then that takes away the potential jeopardy that could go on. We have to remember that many of us that are in this industry, if the federal government tomorrow says that, no, we're going to go after people, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that could be shackled and that people could be arrested potentially. So, that's one of the main issues. And I think that's the reason a lot of conservatives who from a libertarian point of view may be supporting medical marijuana, for instance, that gives them some of the pause for concern. So I think that's the greater one. I think the other one is they have concerns with the potential black market, and make sure that it's not overly regulated. We don't want to become a California model that is overtaxed and overregulated, and we really don't want to be an Oklahoma model that has thousands of licenses that has been granted and virtually no compliance. So both those things can potentially drive the market. So I think ultimately the best cannabis policy for law enforcement is the federal government gets out of the way, turns it over to states' rights, and then law enforcement is allowed to come testify at the state level to voice their concerns, which they have a right to do, because you have to remember law enforcement sees the darkest side of everything. So there's a little bit of it's one of those kind of cognitive biases that we have in law enforcement when we're working stuff so much. We kind of bring always the dark side anytime we testify on things. So we generally bring, a more darker approach to things, and the fact that, everything's more crime's going to occur and people are going to die in the streets and all those kinds of things that you will hear. But the research and the data, since we've had now the cannabis policy for going on over 25 years, and 30 states, 7 states have done it, we now have had brilliant research over years that have showed that in most cases, especially medical cannabis, does not increase crime and doesn't have any alternative effect. In many cases, a lot of law enforcement is concerned about the use of younger people, and we're even seeing data now that people may try it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that legalization leads to more use of marijuana by younger folks. So there's more data out there. I think eventually it's going to happen. In some states, as you know, it's going to be a little bit slower because they're trying to be purposeful in the kind of cannabis policy that they could have. But ultimately, I think the biggest issue is THC levels. There's kind of a misnomer out there on THC levels. THC can generally stay in your system from 28 to 30 days, right? So it can be in there for quite a while. But does that equal toxicity when you're driving and doing certain behaviors that could be against the law? And again, evidence points that you could consume cannabis on a Friday or Saturday night, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be intoxicated, if you go to work on Monday morning. So people need to understand. It depends on the type of cannabis you take and the amount of THC that's in that particular cannabis. All those things matter. But I think there's not enough research for law enforcement to be able to say, well, okay, just because you test positive for THC, that means you're under the influence of the drug.
Yeah, and that's a good question. Yale and the VA had a study that was done through their psychiatric department, and it showed that since 2013, 12.9% growth of users have happened since then. So every year, about 12.9% more people are using cannabis every single year, and it continues to grow along with the legalization of all these states. Oklahoma tried to pass recreational, completely failed. And that really isn't so much a problem with the plant as much as it is with the legal aspect of it. So
yeah, I mean, Oklahoma failed because they failed to have security and compliance in mind, and it's just gone crazy. And the cartels moved locations.
I could tell that after I read the bill, I kind of figured this probably wasn't going to pass. But that being said, a lot of the concerns maybe for the first responders when it comes, let's say it is completely legal, the state issues are very similar to what similar issues they have with the federal. The federal government's just passing those off to the states. And for state officers, for whether they're paramedics or whether they're police officers, nurses, the ability to use cannabis as a medicine would making it federally legal give them that opportunity to do that, or is it still a state level issue that they're going to have to go through the rigmaroles that you're going to have to do with federal policies, right? Going through committees, going through bills. Is that going to have to happen again?
Well, I think that if the federal government passes this bill, it's going to ease some of the restrictions, because remember, law enforcement generally has, especially if you're an investigator, you may have top secret, ultra secret type security clearances where you have databases, you have access to look at NATIS, other federal information, El Paso Information Center and information, all types of information and intelligence gathering that it can occur, and the federal government can set the ability for someone to view that information. And if if you're a consumer and everybody knows that you're a consumer, they may put you on a list, say that you can't have access to that as long as it's federally illegal. So I think this, again, it goes back to the issue of being federally illegal. I think, we have pumped our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines full of opioids and psychotropic medicines, and the fact where the research again shows the medical efficacy that cannabis can play a significant role in helping them. And as a first responder that has suffered from many of those issues, I was involved in the federal building, um, um, federal court building shootout and bombing incident in 1993. We all kind of go through these issues that we have, and their first responders are similar to the military veterans, that there's a lot of people suffering from PTSD. You have a lot of EMS and fire workers that see horrible things. And, we have a tendency to, law enforcement is known for drinking too much.
Yep.
As a dealing with those things. We have high divorce rates. So there's no question that medical cannabis in particular could be very helpful for first responders, as it is and has shown to be for veterans. We are seeing the federal government starting to do more research on the impact of veterans. I think a bill's going to pass. I don't know if it's going to be Mace's bill. I support her bill completely, and I've actually testified in support of her bill. I hope it does pass. But I think those are the biggest issues. I think the other issue is, how do you determine? A lot of law enforcement officials will say, well, how can we determine whether somebody is under the influence of cannabis on a car stop? And again, I make the argument that if you use a field sobriety test, being under the influence of cannabis and under the influence of alcohol really affects the same with respect to motor skills. And so your motor skill test of your field sobriety test is going to be the same as with alcohol, and what's called the gaze nystagmus test. I don't know if you're familiar with the gaze nystagmus, but it's the eye test that's done by law enforcement out in the field. They'll put a pin in somebody's eye and move it back and forth. Maybe you've seen that before. That's called the gaze nystagmus test. The pupil is definitely dilated and affected in that test when you administer it if you're under the influence of alcohol. And the same thing occurs when you're under the influence of cannabis. So I make the argument it doesn't change at all. We just can't do a BAC level test, right? Like we do in alcohol, to confirm somebody's under the influence. Well, they're going to blow a 1.5 or something like that. We can't do that with cannabis. And that's their greatest concern. I was around when we didn't have BAC. I started out as a state trooper when you just couldn't do a BAC test out in the field quickly. So that's showing you my age. But we still arrested people for driving under the influence because the field sobriety test proved it. So if you're under the influence of something, the field sobriety test is going to prove it, and then you should arrest folks based on that test. That's my argument. So little things change.
I think that's a good point too. There's a degree of how much you've consumed that will give you the impairment, right? And normally on cannabis, depending on the person, most people I know will do just microdosing throughout the day, so it doesn't impair them to the point where they can't have a conversation or drive a vehicle or be able to go anywhere. But they're at the same point in time, now they don't have pain in their knees and things of that nature. So it does seem that it's always going to be the amount, right? So some people can drink 3 or 4 beers and they can't go anywhere. And there's people we've all seen drink 3 or 4 beers and act like nothing happened. And it is concerning that we don't have a way to measure it yet. But I think people need to also understand that it doesn't matter whether it's federal law or not. That's public safety at the smallest point to the city, and they're all going to be concerned about that.
Right. Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, their job is to protect people, and you don't want people that are under the influence and crash their car. And that happens. You can be under the influence of, and you could have a lot of accidents as a result of doing that. Do you have more than alcohol? No. We're crashing cars right and left, under the influence of alcohol. So this is where I don't see this as any different from alcohol. As a matter of fact, I think more people, I think when you consume, especially cannabis, unless it's very high THC, and it's and as you probably know, and the folks out there know, where more and more people are not, it's just not high doses of THC. People are looking at the impact between terpenes and THC levels, and maybe lower THC levels and higher doses of terpenes when they're doing their recipes. There's so many folks that are experimenting with how it's going to affect not only mentally but physically, and that also means that you may not be as intoxicated because you're taking low levels and you have higher doses of terpenes when you're consuming. So you're absolutely right. It really depends on the individual specifically. But I can tell you, I never wrestled someone using cannabis out in the street. I never, when I was arresting somebody for something, they came back later and tested positive for cannabis. I went, oh yeah, they're a cannabis smoker. That's the reason I arrested. It just doesn't happen. I might have to buy them cookies or chips, to settle
That would be
down.
about it. I
Yeah.
have one final question I want to go over. Why is it that it seems like top brass in the police departments seem to be more against legalization than the ones on the ground? The ones on the ground seem to have far more real-time data and information about the community than the top brass do. So why does it seems, at least from the perspective of the citizen, why does it seem to be such a distance between the two when it comes to this?
Yeah, I think law enforcement executives focus on the thing. And since I was a sheriff of a major county, I understand. I think law enforcement executives focus on the things that I just talked about more than the impact at the field level. That's first and foremost. They look at unintended consequences far more than maybe a field officer might. I think the other thing, quite frankly, is age. Age has had a significant influence. We're starting to have more younger chiefs and sheriffs and directors and things like that. I think as time continues to go, you have to understand, we've been barked at for centuries about the evils of marijuana. I mean, it's
Right.
me, it was akin to heroin or opium and so there's still that cognitive bias out there for a lot of folks that are older that hasn't been educated yet and not enough. They think maybe some of the research may have a bias when it's done, and there's constituents out there that still want it. And of course, if you're a sheriff or elected official, whether or not your county and the constituents want it is another thing that they look at when you're a senior executive. But I think over time, it's just like we've had now 37 states pass it. I think over time, we're going to see less and less people that are vehemently against it, as opposed to just having caution and want to have a discussion on what type of cannabis should be allowed, how much, whether it's medical versus rec, all those kinds of things. And I think those are worthwhile arguments, for folks. Every state's different, and every state should be different in how they want to handle certain public policy.
I believe it is a lot about acceptance. You'll see that in the United States, the acceptance rate isn't nearly as high as it is in Amsterdam or in Holland, where they've been using it for a number of years. And even over there, when you go to talk to them, it's such woven into the fabric of their own community. It's just part of everyday life. And for a lot of us over here in the United States, we can't really grasp that concept that marijuana is part of everyday life. But for them, it's not really marijuana. It's just an herb that they use for medicine, and that it helps things move along. Same thing in Jamaica. They just use it and view it in a much different aspect. But of course, in Jamaica, can't be legal because the United States won't let them. And in there is the federal issue that we're here talking about. Thank you so much, Dr. Myers, for coming on and talking about this specific subject. It is important that people understand the reason that the first responders are not against cannabis. That is not necessarily the case. I think a lot of the misconception is the fact that it's not quite accepted fully all the way around, and the federal government is still very much in the way.
Absolutely. That's very true. So I think it's important to contact your legislators, especially at the congressional level now. It doesn't matter what party they are, contact them so you can educate them, especially, and say how important the Overton window is closed on this topic, I believe. You cannot, as the federal government, let 37 states pass this without allowing it to be legalized and pass on to the states. That is legal chaos. And the federal government should never allow legal chaos. They need to say, we've let this happen. It's time to act and be responsible now and turn it back over to the states. That's the only accepted venue or avenue going forward.
I agree. A majority of first responders, I would say majority of first responders, but a lot of veterans are first responders. The veteran workforce is roughly 6% in the labor force across the United States. But when we talk about first responders, that doubles to triple easily. When we start talking about nurses, we start talking about police officers, firefighters, and things of that nature, it dramatically jumps up way higher than just 6%. And so when we talk about, when we make these discussions, it is veteran related because so many veterans are also our first responders. Thanks a lot, Dr. Myers. We'll talk to you soon.